Okay. So, um, so I'm sitting here in my office right now, and I'm looking at you, Megan. And I'm remembering, and we just had a conversation about a colleague that we went to school with a while back,
Uh-huh.
which led me to remember your lightning talk from a while back, where you said, "I finished school at UVA, and I just decided to go to Prague, Czechoslovakia." And
Yep.
I kind of wanted to know more about what you were doing 30 years ago and how it, in any way, if it did, affected the fact that you and I are sitting here talking to each other today.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, like it when you think about your life story, all of these things sort of coalesce into like for me at least, a pretty um stable life story. So I got my undergrad from Georgia in 1990, and then I worked for a year at MoMA, and then I got my master's degree, and I graduated in 93 from UVA in art history, and there just weren't any jobs. So I decided I had a boyfriend who was getting a doctorate in classics, who had quit the year before and gone to Prague. And he would write letters about how you could do anything you wanted to in Prague. And so I went there, and it was really, you could pretty much do anything that you wanted to do. It was pretty exciting. And the way I made my money to live was I was a real estate agent in Prague for the Western. So this was right after the revolution,
Mhm.
like 4 years after the revolution. And lots of Western companies were coming to do business stuff, and their employees needed places to live. So I was in charge of finding apartments for the Western lawyers mostly. And then we had Czech people who were in charge of the Czech people who had the apartments. And so it was a really great job. Like I really learned Prague really well. I went all over the place all of the time. And it's funny, like like the Czechs kind of didn't. So most of them had like a dacha out in the country that didn't really have running water or electricity, and they would go there on the weekends from Prague. Like they would go every weekend to their little hut, their little farmhouse out in the middle of nowhere. And so what they wanted to do was they would just go live in the dacha, but it didn't have running water or electricity, so they wanted to come back every weekend to this apartment they were renting for like $1,200 a month. They wanted to keep all their clothes in their apartment. And that just wasn't going to work. So like we had to have Czech people who were explaining, like, no, if you move out of your apartment, you really truly have to move out. But I also got involved with a lot of my own personal projects, and one of those projects was I started offering walking tours of Old Town Prague, because I had the art history, and I knew about. I didn't study Czech art in school, but I knew how to find out about it. And I started offering in-person walking tours, but then cutting edge technology of Walkman walking tours of Prague. And that was really fun. And then I did a Walkman tour of the Prague galleries, the Czech National Collection. But when I started doing that, they had to close almost immediately when I got that job, because they were going to have to repatriate a whole bunch of their stuff to Jewish families whose work had been stolen from them by the Nazis and put into the Czech National Collection. So they had to close for something like 4 years to figure out like what kind of museum they had after that. And there's a museum there. There's a Czech National Galleries, but it's different than the museum I knew when I was developing my project. Yeah, and so I lived there for I guess until about 95. So I was there for about 2.5 years. And there was a civil war in Yugoslavia at the time. And lots of refugees from Yugoslavia and Macedonia. And the Czechs didn't want those refugees. So they would close off whole squares. Like they would trap everybody in Wenceslas Square, for example. And if you didn't have paperwork, you would just be taken straight to the airport. Like you didn't go home and pack. You were just gone. And so I got a regular job because the real estate job was under the table, of course. And so I had to get a normal job with paperwork. And for that, I was a travel agent. So we made like reservations for people who, like in the back of the TWA magazine, they were like, visit Bohemia for $800, right? Like that sort of package deal. So I put the package together. And again, we had computers in 93. There were computers, but not fancy ones. It was all like relationships. One of the interesting things about Prague in terms of information science is that, so there wasn't really any infrastructure, no tech infrastructure there when I got there. Like, you didn't have a phone in your house necessarily. There were no phones. And so the way that you would find people is you would go to the coffee house that you thought that they would go to. So there was this really famous coffee house on the corner of the road that was on the Vltava, and it was right downtown. And there was a big like bulletin board, and you would just put up a note saying, I'm looking for so-and-so. I will be here every Wednesday from 2 to 4. And then you would just have to be there, and they would see the note and they would come and meet you. And that's how you like got together with people. That was it. And it was one of the only places where people, this was in 93, that had cell phones. Like, people in America didn't have cell phones. People in Prague definitely had cell phones because there wasn't any infrastructure for any other kind of like connection with other people, which is interesting, I think.
Yeah. It is interesting. I mean, the thought of being, a recent graduate of university and deciding to go to a country where I'm going to guess you perhaps didn't speak the language.
Did not speak the language.
And then actually having a real job, even if it was under the table, and actually doing things is just astounding to me. Because if I think back to when I was that age, eons ago, I barely learned how to tie my shoes, and I was, the thought of not having somebody tell me what to do, I don't know what I would have done.
Yeah, I kind of don't understand like what it was in me that was like, I'm just going to go to Prague. I'm sure it was that I had a friend there. Like, if I hadn't had a friend there, I probably wouldn't have done it. And by the time I got there, he was no longer my boyfriend. He was just a person I knew, but still I knew him. And he had actually started this bookstore, an expat bookstore and coffee shop. And called the Globe. So if you ever like go to Prague, it still exists. They sold it. But it was definitely the place to be. And so once I connected with him, like, I knew a lot of people in Prague. So that was really lucky. And it was just sort of like there was literally nothing to do here. Like, there were no jobs in 1992. Definitely no jobs in museums.
Right.
And I think so 87, there was a big recession in 87.
Right.
And we weren't recovered from it in 92. So they're just, I worked at the Museum of Modern Art in the year between undergrad and graduate school, UVA graduate school. And I worked in the photography department, and it was an okay job. It was actually really interesting. I was just like the secretary, but I also was, in that time, I don't know if this is still true for the photography department, the collection was held in the office. So like the photography collection was like 10 steps away from me from the front door. And we had a library connected to our offices too, like right next to my front desk, there was the library. So I was the library assistant, and the library handled the collection. And photographers would come and like peruse the collection, and our library collection had art photography books in it, like really important photography books.
Mm.
So that's where I sort of got the idea of being an art librarian. And we also had this thing, which I think probably still exists, which is the weekly photography review, where photographers would send in their work and the curators would look at it and then return it without any comments. But it was a way for the curators to keep up to date with what's happening in contemporary photography. And every now and then they would buy a piece. But you definitely couldn't handle that. I was in charge of that. So like the art handling, I got some experience doing that. I had the library experience. So it was not a terrible like job, except that it only paid, and even in $1990, this sucks. It was $14,000 a year.
Yeah.
And there's literally no way, even in 1990, to live in New York City for $14,000 a year. It was the only reason I could do it was because my parents owned a house in Brooklyn and I could live with them.
Oh.
And I didn't want to continue doing that,
Yeah.
for the rest of
Yeah. Yeah. You mentioning Prague caused me to think back. And one of the reasons I asked questions, I was curious about Prague. But at the time you were doing that, I wasn't.
Yeah.
I was still in the service. It was my last active duty assignment, and I was at our Defense Language Institute Foreign Language Center at the Presidio of Monterey in California. And I'd been a student there, in the late 1970s to learn language. And as a student, the only thing you did is learn language. But I got sent back there in '91 to be the second in command.
Oh.
And so the first in command had big thoughts. And second in command was my responsibility was keep the enterprise going.
Right.
And so one of the things I had to do, check again, is we had a department called multi-languages, and it was the smaller European languages that we didn't have enough students who needed the language to have a complete department. So we had one department had multi-languages in it, and it had in it Czech and Serbo-Croatian. And because the student body at the Defense Language Institute are basically soldiers, and they need to know these languages to do soldier things. And 1989 had happened, and the Warsaw Pact had disintegrated. Suddenly, nobody needed to learn Czech anymore because we didn't have any Czech enemies to pay attention to. And we didn't have enough need for Czech language for just, cultural relations, etc. And so we didn't get any more students in Czech. And this being a U.S. Army organization and a Department of Defense organization, we couldn't keep our Czech instructors if they had no students.
Right.
So we tried, we had to reduce before that in another language. So we tried the best we could to find them another civil service job they're qualified for that had a vacancy to put them in, but we had more instructors than we had vacancies. And so it was a sad time to have to, say, this is the last paycheck. But one of the things we did with that is in the process of drawing down a program like the Czech language program is that the faculty members are all civil servants, and they're members of a U.S. government union. I forgot the exact name of it. There are two civil servant unions. They can't strike. That got taken away from them during the Reagan years.
Right.
But you still had to negotiate with them on conditions of employment. And as I said, I was the number 2 guy, and the number 2, the boss said, I've got big thoughts to think of. You do all the union negotiation. So I was the guy who had to negotiate with the union about changes in faculty stuff.
That's interesting.
And when we had to draw down the thing, and all these faculty members are going to lose their jobs, and some of them had only recently arrived from from what was then Czechoslovakia.
Right.
And some had been actually living in California for 30 years and were teaching these things, and now they're gone. It came as a surprise to me that what they didn't ask for much. They knew we were trying our best to place them in positions where they were qualified for that civil service position, but the majority were not. What they asked for is, if we have to lose our jobs and our paycheck, we would like a parting gift from you, and that would be to give us a lifetime access to the library on the Presidio of Monterey.
Interesting.
Because we had a library, it was called the John Iso Library, and it was a multi-language library in which the library staff did not even recognize the scripts in which these books are written in 40 different languages, but the faculty did. And this was their connection to their culture and their home. And, that was an easy thing for us to say yes to. But I was always impressed about how important that cultural connection through what was then primarily books was for this group. And again, your mention about the Civil War in Yugoslavia at that time, we had that in Monterey, California at that time as well, as I would sit in there in my job of dealing with issues of the day. And I would have an appointment with one faculty member in our Serbo-Croatian department who would come in to explain to me the history of Serbs and Croats and how Serbs were oppressed by Croats and Croats were Nazis. And then the next day I would have an instructor from the Serbo-Croatian department come in and explain to me that the Serbs were fascists and genocidal maniacs. And we can't work together to teach this one language that is divided by a script, not by the language. And so my role was to listen, learn, take no sides, and try to get them to work with each other. Or the Korean instructors that came in and said another instructor had insulted them by speaking to them in a particular Korean manner that was hard to understand for an English speaker, but it's the way you would talk if you're speaking to an animal, but not to a human. And how they wanted me to discipline that person. And that wasn't what I needed to do either. But so yeah, it's amazing. But that thing about that confluence of cultures and ways of understanding and the connection to books stuck with me. But this conversation just led me to remember one thing from that time in my life that really stuck with me. And it was that school in Monterey, California, was originally stood up and formed at the Presidio of San Francisco in 1941. And they only taught one language, and it was Japanese. And the student body was made up of Americans of Japanese descent who didn't speak Japanese. And it was to teach them to speak Japanese because of the anticipation of the Second World War. And so all during the Second World War, the school got kicked out of California because of craziness and had to go to Minnesota, but basically they taught Japanese in that. So in 1991 was the 50th anniversary of the school, and the Alumni Association, which included at that time several congressmen, several Medal of Honor winners, several significant California personalities, John Iso being one, came back for the 50th anniversary celebration of the establishment of the school, which rotated back to Monterey in 1946. And I was representing the current establishment went to a big get together, dinner, stuff like that. You know, the standard stuff. You wear fancy clothes, people give speeches, etc. And for the first time in my life, I felt what it means to be not part of the majority group.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sitting there at the table with all these wonderful people of Japanese heritage, Americans, everyone of Japanese heritage, and they were great to talk to. We had things in common, stuff like that. But there were moments when I might just sit back from the table and I realized as they were talking, they had such shared connections and such shared understandings that I was superfluous to the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Had I not been there, nothing would have changed because I didn't really count. I didn't feel bad about it. It just, I didn't really count. And I can remember feeling, this must be what it feels like to be somebody else other than who I am.
Right.
And there was a moment in that affair. I was perfectly happy. I was not ill-treated. It was great. I just happened to stand up and I just looked across the room, and it's just a mass of people who all have a shared experience and a shared language. And I saw a guy across the room, and he was an Army major, I think. He was an African-American black guy. And he's in uniform like I'm in uniform. And we just happened to catch each other's eye across the room of like 1,000 people there.
Mm-hmm.
And he just nodded at me as if to say, you and me, buddy, we're on the same team.
Uh-huh.
We're different from these guys. And he didn't mean that in a bad way. It just meant he was feeling the same way from a distance. And he saw pale face, different color uniform, but there was a connection. And both of us were sitting there saying, we're outsiders in this group, but we have a connection with each other. And I don't know, something along those lines is maybe think about the cultural realities that we deal with in our field. So when I stumbled into this field and got here, and Barbara Moran asked me to teach a class on cultural information, understanding of information through cultural lenses. I kind of leaped at the opportunity to do that because I guess I'd been conditioned from 30 years ago. Serbo-Croatian faculty, Arabic and Persian faculty, the Chinese faculty, the Czech faculty that we unfortunately had to let go, Russian faculty of all different kinds, and that everybody's got their own story, everybody's got their own reality, everybody's got their own life. And it's expressed in many different ways. And I don't know, I thought, geez, the opportunity to engage that here.
How does that affect your teaching now?
I pay attention. I mean, I've learned to understand where our students come from. I just had a conversation with a student today, and he was educating me about his home in India and why I needed to visit it and all the various languages in there. And I feel like I'm a better person for that. But 30 years ago, your job is to go convince the union to accept that we're laying off everybody. Thank you for that job. But today, I am so happy I had that opportunity 30 years ago to do that, and to be here and to see this next generation of students, and know that, if we do our work right, you and I know we do, that we'll have people who can think both deeply and broadly simultaneously, and can see differences and understand differences, but not be negatively conditioned by that. I feel pretty good about what we do. And I think it gets back to you having the guts to just go and do something, and me finding myself feeling like this must be what it's like to be the other. I've never felt this ever. And
Well, yeah, I definitely felt that in Prague. I mean, I tried to learn Czech, of course, because I lived there. And it's a pretty hard language. It's a Slavic language. So it has declensions and like it's different. It's different than English. And I don't know, like I gave them the benefit of the doubt that they just had never heard bad Czech before. They had never heard people speak bad Czech. And so when I spoke poorly, bad grammar and stuff, they'd just be like, I don't understand what you're talking about. And it was frustrating. I mean, they might have just been tired of Americans, but I want to give them the benefit of the doubt that they just had never heard bad Czech. And or ungrammatical Czech, I guess I should say. So yeah, it's hard being an expat. It really is. Like it's the thing that keeps me from moving away from here is that you really just don't fit in. You never are going to fit in again once you're an expat, as in my experience.
well, yeah, that's true if you're an expat, but at some point you may transition from being an expat to just being a person,
Yeah, if you can get citizenship.
or you can be there long enough in some fashion. So we just got an email from a friend of ours from pre-1991 in Germany, and they mentioned that they still feel that we're part of their family.
Oh, that's nice.
And I like that.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I guess our students, they may not know it, they may not even care, but the paths that you and I walked to get here affect the way we do things in class and how we structure things. And I have a confidence that we're doing a decent job, and especially that you and I, pay attention to who they are and validate their existence and their lived experience. And every semester, what I learn from the students affects what I do in the next semester.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think
Well,
that's both of us.
I see that Susan is getting ready. Anyway, we're about ready to wrap up. This has been more fun than anything.
Yeah. A good conversation. I wish we could take questions from the people, but
Well, they can find our email address.
you can ask me, you can find me in the halls and ask me questions.
Yep, me too. As I tell my students, if the door's open and I'm here, come on in. If the door's shut, then I'm somewhere wandering around. Find me. Well, this has been a joy. Thank you very much, Megan.
Thank you, Ron.
For those of you who are watching us don't know this, Megan and I have been in class together back 20 years ago.
20 years ago. Yeah.
So we've known each other for a while.
For a long time.
So
Okay.
I guess we can wrap it up and do things. We're done.
All right. Thanks a lot. Bye, everybody.
See you.